Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the 3Cs 2022 conference. This morning's panel is comprised of a range of key experts within the Commonwealth as well as within the Caribbean on anti-corruption. My name is Josh Drayton, the Financial Crimes and Asset Recovery Specialist at CARICOM IMPACS, and I will be your moderator for this panel. I think most of us are aware by now that there is a very strong link between corruption and development, as corruption erodes resources that can be used for developmental purposes. This panel in particular will be focusing on corruption and development within the Caribbean and also touching a bit on the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Goal 16, which looks at institutions. On today's panel, we have several key experts, and I will start with Dr. Roger Koranteng, who is the head of the Public Sector Governance Unit of the Commonwealth Secretariat. We also have Canon Kendall, who is the chairman of the Commonwealth Caribbean Association of Anti-Corruption, of Integrity Commissions and Anti-Corruption Bodies. And we have also on this call Ms. Jeanette Calder, who is the Executive Director of Accountability Meetup Portal. Joining us now is Professor Trevor Munroe, who is the Principal Director of National Integrity Action in Jamaica, also the local chapter of Transparency International. So I would like to welcome all members of the panel. Just to give you some insight in terms of the format of this morning's panel, we would have key opening remarks by members of the panel. That would then be followed by a round of questions, which you, of course, members of the audience, at any point in time can post your questions in the chat, and then we'll be able to respond to those. At the end of this session, we would have some key takeaways, a round again of 1 minute key takeaways from members of the panel. So without further ado, I'm going to kind of hand over to Dr. Roger Koranteng to give us a feel coming from the Commonwealth, looking at some of the key issues and challenges, specifically with development. But what are you seeing on your side, Dr. Koranteng, in terms of some of the changes and issues or challenges in addressing corruption?
Yeah, thank you, Josh, for the invitation. And good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may. Organizers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from the Commonwealth, but currently I'm in Washington, D.C. attending International Anti-Corruption Conference, dubbed as one of the greatest collection of anti-corruption practitioners and policymakers in the world. I am pleased to be invited to speak at this important seminar under the overall theme, the Caribbean Conference on Corruption, Compliance, and Cybercrime 2022. Thanks for the invitation. Dr. Boyce, Head, Office of Integrity, Compliance, and Accountability, the Caribbean Development Bank. As you know, I will start with the Commonwealth Secretariat work. Our work is a three-pronged approach. What we seek to do is to bring all the anti-corruption agencies around the Commonwealth to form what we call a network or association. So we have one in Africa, one in Caribbean, Pacific, and Asia. We also do capacity building, where we try to capacitate the lead anti-corruption agencies in member countries. And then we do research and publication. Mr. Chairman, as we all come to the terms, with the climate change and natural disasters sweeping our blue islands, there is this invisible infection that the world continues to fight. Much like the coronavirus, the corruption virus strikes with no regards for borders, race, politics, or religion. And like the illness that countries are so desperately battling, corruption causes a huge human and financial cost. putting the most vulnerable at risk. In developing countries, as we all know, according to the UN Development Program, funds lost to corruption are estimated at 10 times the amount of official development assistance received. Now, the ferocious storm of corruption are very destructive. This affects every stage of human development from cradle to old age, from womb to tomb. And according to the IMF, the success of all the SDGs depend crucially on getting to grips with the corrosive cancer of corruption. And that globally, amount of money lost through corruption equals to the total amount of money needed to successfully implement the SDGs. Now, corruption poses a unique development challenge in small states. Now, these countries are particularly vulnerable to exogenous shocks, such as natural disasters, climate change. With limited economic opportunities and significant migration, they often face capacity constraints. Small states remain susceptible to external shocks, such as results of the geographic positioning, inherent structural challenges, and deep integration into the global economy. So there is a need to take a swift and decisive action to improve transparency and accountability, and to build confidence and ensuring that the institutions and systems are corruption-free. So corruption takes many forms. It is the foreign company that pays kickbacks or bribe to get preferential treatment, leaving poor countries with devalued goods and services. It is the public officer who betrays the public. He or she is charged to assist for financial favors. And it is the town that has no school or health clinic because local officials have stolen the money that would have built them. And it is the prescription that don't cure or even kill because someone has diluted them or substituted counterfeit medicine. Now, these age-long problems of corrupt practices keep evolving as we still find news headlines filled with scandals of corruption touching virtually every country. Once entrenched, corruption is hard to root out. Focusing only on strict enforcement tend to make little progress. In many societies, corrupt behavior is deeply rooted in the social norms and political culture, and the incentives to maintain the status quo are powerful. Corruption can lead to theft, wastage, and misuse of scarce resources. It can also entrench elite privilege and inequality, undermining institutions of accountability and lasting consequences, and diminishing citizens' faith in their own government. While some of the principles for controlling corruption are well known, such as transparency and accountability, open governance, civil society, monitoring, detection, and enforcement, the strategies for applying them can vary considerably depending on the context. The world is changing, becoming a hyper-globalized, and seeing the advent and penetration of new technologies offer both challenges and opportunities. We must strengthen accountability system, income and assets declaration by public officials, and more information open to the public, the use of electronic systems and declaration and verification. Technological advancement could help to strengthen public finances, financial management, limit the prevalence of ghost workers, and improving monitoring of infrastructure projects, and strengthening transparency and efficiency of public procurement. People have been either fighting corruption or have been a victim of it for decades. So should we accept it as a feature of life and carry on, or try to fight it wherever we can? The size and geographic location and stage of development of small island states, such as those in the Caribbean, means that these countries literally cannot afford to tolerate acts of corruption. In small states, islands, decisions in the economic, political, and legal fields have a pervasive that they lack in large societies. This is because people are connected to each other in many ways in small societies. And in such societies, one cannot progress very far occupationally or professionally without coming into contact with the government. Now, many roles are played by few individuals, so the same individuals constantly interact. This has a profound implication for economic and social development, since decisions and choices of individuals will influence their relations in many contexts and with other individuals. The reality creates an environment where reporting acts of corruption may be challenging because of the possibility of being targeted and labeled as an informer. This situation serves to reinforce the reluctance to be a whistleblower, and as such has left room for corruption to grow in the Caribbean, even in the face of improvement in legislation and oversight institutions. It can be argued that a small and closely knit society such as the Caribbean state means they are prone to corruption and other governance issues. However, we have Commonwealth Secretariat have done studies and have identified factors that institutions within 6 countries that have contributed to the reduction of impact of corruption and seek to account for the factors, both technical and political, that have enabled them to implement successful anti-corruption strategies. Drawing lessons from the compendium of case studies from these 6 countries in the Commonwealth Caribbean, Barbados, Bahamas, Dominica, Grenada, and St. Louis and St. Vincent, the findings demonstrated that all is not lost and that it is possible to reduce corruption risk even in the most challenging environment. The complex nature of corruption means that technical solutions and added compliance measures will usually be insufficient. A good understanding of the historical origin, social norms, and the political culture is often critical to design impactful policies and institutional structures that can support their implementation. The Commonwealth Caribbean Studies conspired to present approaches and policies responses to various countries' contests. It reinforces that there is no single formula or magic bullet to address corruption. For example, open government reforms can be effective in promoting ethos of transparency and inclusiveness and collaboration, in shifting norms over time by making conditions less conducive to corrupt activities. However, their impact depends on the existence of other enabling factors, and most importantly, such as the political will, a free and independent media, a robust civil society, and an effective accountability and sanctioning mechanism. The case studies features in these studies highlight that multiple factors contribute to the impact of anti-corruption effort in the region, including political leadership, institutional capacity, incentives, technology, transparency and collaboration. Enhanced collaboration with stakeholders within and outside of government is critical success factor in overall government effectiveness. Now, such collaboration involves both the public and private sectors, civil society, media, research organizations, think tanks, and citizens. Strengthening the fight against corruption is a collective responsibility. Mr. Chairman, finally, let me propose only 5 strategies for overcoming corruption challenges in the Caribbean. 1, government should enact effective political campaign finance legislation to ensure that political parties frequently report their finances, including all donations received and expenditures, to independent election authority. Additionally, they should establish a cap on political campaign spending to limit the influence that money has during elections. 2, reversing the burden of proof in corruption court cases. The proposition will place the burden of proof on the persons pursued for corruption to prove his innocence and not the anti-corruption institution, contrary to the current prevailing principles in corruption cases. Number 3, declaration of assets and liabilities by public officials, particularly before and after their tenure in office, be made compulsory and verifiable as a major step in ensuring probity in public life. It must include their outside activities, employment, investment, assets, and substantial gift or benefit. Such disclosures allow public employees' wealth to be monitored. Let's note that asset declaration without verification overall does not tackle corruption. 4, lifestyle audit to determine the lifestyle of public officials in commensurate with their person's known income stream to identify possible corruption, fraud, and or other related offenses. And last but not the least is beneficial ownership register. A beneficial owner is defined as a natural person or persons who ultimately owns and controls someone fronting for him or her, or the natural person on whose behalf a transaction is being conducted. It will also include those persons who exercise ultimate effective control over a legal person or an arrangement, because anonymity enables many illegal activities such as tax evasion, corruption, money laundering, and stolen assets to take place out of the view of the law enforcement authorities. Mr. Chairman, if we can implement these strategies, corruption will be reduced drastically in the shortest possible time. However, the big question is, will there be a political will to implement these strategies? I hope this Caribbean Conference on Corruption, Compliance, and Cybercrime 2022 will trigger an open-minded discussion in the Caribbean so that we can all think about ways to tackle this problem. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, let's think about this. I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koranteng. And I'm very thankful for that overview, contextualizing the cost of corruption, some of the things in terms of the Commonwealth initiatives, but then coming down into some of the deeper issues as to what are some of the steps we should take. And I think a cross-cutting issue there is political will. So I guess a good segue from the political will question is institutional will and institutional capacity. So Canon, Mark Kendall, can you share with us a bit of what are you seeing from on your side of the anti-corruption bodies and integrity commissions within the region, and how your work is facilitating the fight against corruption? So over to you, Canon.
Thank you very much, Josh, and I want to acknowledge with thanks the invitation that was sent to me by Dr. Boyce and his team. I also want to acknowledge the presence in this panel of Dr. Koranteng and Dr. Munroe. Among them, I'm a neophyte in anti-corruption. I sit at their feet, in particular Dr. Koranteng, from whom I've gleaned very much. And some of what I want to say, I've actually gotten directly from him. Fellow practitioners, I believe that none of us is debating at this forum that sustainable economic development in the Caribbean will be harmed by continuing and increasing corruption. We are aware of the global statistics presented by the United Nations, whereby $1 trillion is paid in bribe annually, and 2.6 trillion is stolen from public funds every year. Moreover, the United Nations has established that 5% of global GDP is lost to corruption annually. It may be difficult to pinpoint an accurate figure that relates to the Caribbean context, but even if that number is below the global average, we can translate that into potable water, paved roads, schools, medical facilities, public transportation. I'm mindful of what the Secretary General said, Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and I quote, "Throughout the world, including in member countries of the Commonwealth, corruption continues to undermine social and economic development and have immensely damaging consequences, especially for the poorest and most vulnerable of people and communities." End of quote. The Commonwealth has been very instrumental in anti-corruption activities in this region, particularly through the formation of our association. And Dr. Koranteng was the one who planted the seed in this region many years ago. The association now comprises 14 territories. And in regard to the theme for this conference, I believe that my first point would be collaboration. As the Commonwealth Secretariat has collaborated with various jurisdictions in the Caribbean, we among ourselves in the Caribbean need to have more collaboration. We need the sharing of information from legislation to standard operational procedures. In our association, we have created a comparison matrix of information from various jurisdictions. We have many commonalities, especially in challenges experienced. And I want to say that sitting here in the Turks and Caicos Islands, that we boast of having one of the most comprehensive legislations in the region. And our legislation is being used by at least one other country in the region to establish theirs. And this is the sort of collaboration we ought to have, because it is not necessary for any country to start from scratch, because we already have things in place in other territories which will be able to help them. We have issues in terms of the challenges that we face collectively. When we sit at conferences, you hear the same thing coming up over and over again. Anti-corruption agencies, they're challenged by financing and independence. It is untenable for us to make run-of-the-mill decisions in our agencies and have to have those decisions approved by cabinet or by a particular minister. Furthermore, it's ridiculous to have to ask a government for money to investigate the said government. It encroaches upon our independence. And I can say all of us in the association, in the various jurisdictions, we have that issue to face. And it goes against the grain of the Jakarta principles and the Commonwealth anti-corruption benchmarks. I strongly believe that anti-corruption should be put on the agenda of the CARICOM heads of government meeting. I'm not sure whether it has ever been there, but if it's not, it's time that it's there. And I believe CARICOM and even the CDB, they are well placed to encourage and impress upon governments that they need to do more with regard to anti-corruption, and in particular in supporting and financing
I'm sorry, it seems as though we've lost Canon. Kendall? Canon, are you back?
I'm here.
Excellent. So please go ahead.
I'm here. I'm speaking about the application of legislation and enforcement. On several occasions, was made before in their anti-corruption efforts. And you have said that in Singapore, people prefer dealing with God rather with the anti-corruption regime, simply because they know that God forgives. But their anti-corruption regime doesn't. Now, our countries are able to create legislation, whether by their own volition or out of fear of being blacklisted by CFATF or given a poor rating by Transparency International. But for more than one reason, they do not effect it to the extent that it encompasses. Apparently, Singapore has been able to promote a cultural shift in the right direction through knowledge of and respect for their legislation and the fear of the penalty of running afoul of it. The duration between passing of legislation and the establishing and resourcing of the framework to execute the legislation is an inordinate amount of time in this region. My third point has to do with prevention, in particular education. While Singapore did well by means of the big stick and by naming and shaming, I think that comprehensive legislation, investigation, enforcement, and asset recovery must be complemented by greater efforts in prevention. I think that it's unfortunate that the success of anti-corruption agencies seem to be predicated on the number of successes in investigations, prosecutions, convictions, and asset recovery. Increasing resources are dedicated to these aspects of the anti-corruption fight. I dare say that in this regard, the resources invested are never commensurate with their returns. We in the Turks and Caicos Islands are a little bit more fortunate than others. We have had a trial going on since 2015, and we have spent over $40 million on that trial. But we are grateful that in the asset recovery scheme that we've been able to recover at least half of that money, together with 2,500 acres of land. But this cannot be said for many jurisdictions. In our association and in the Turks and Caicos Islands, I've advocated that there must be modules on anti-corruption in our education curricula. I'm reminded again of Dr. Koranteng, referring to his visit to one of the Scandinavian countries for our conference. And in going to his conference, passing a school day by day, he was listening to the children doing recitations, but he wasn't aware of what they were saying because he didn't know the language. But afterward, when he inquired, he found out that they were reciting anti-corruption slogans and poems. And they were very young children, if you recall, Dr. K. Now, I believe that we in this region need to place more emphasis on education, both formal and informal, both direct and indirect. And it is my hope that we can see anti-corruption modules in our education curricula. In the Turks and Caicos Islands, we are making some progress in this regard because we have already engaged the cooperation of the Education Department. In addition, we are undertaking a proactive strategy to consult, visit, examine, and advise government departments in a non-adversarial way to identify and seek to block loopholes conducive to corruption in their operations. And there's a free subliminal message in this strategy. It is that the Integrity Commission is ever present and it's watching you. It's looking at your policy, your procedures. And the third P is that we are present. At the Caribbean Conference last year, regional educators such as Dr. Wendy Crawford and Dr. Christina Hines asserted that anti-corruption could be fought in the education arena from cradle to grave. And so I suggest to you that we in this region in fighting corruption, we know that it's a severe impediment to sustainable development. However, we can fight corruption with more collaboration, with more comprehensive legislation and the application of same. We can also do better in fighting corruption by making more investment in prevention, particularly in the education sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Canon Kendall, for looking at your work, in particular, highlighting some of the key issues, collaboration, looking specifically at legislation, and of course, prevention. And it's a very good segue into the work of civil society organizations in assisting anti-corruption bodies such as that in the TCI and the rest of the region. So I would now hand over to Professor Trevor Munroe, who would share some insights in terms of what they're doing at the local chapter of Transparency International National Integrity Action. Over to you, Professor Munroe.
Thank you very much, Josh, and greetings to my fellow panelists and to the CDB for continuing to sponsor this extraordinarily important conference, which we have seen 2 previous occasions, and I'm sure this one will outdo the last 2. May I begin by taking up the last point that Mark raised, and at the same time endorse underlined in red ink and blue ink all that Roger said in relation to the overarching costs of corruption, the harm it does, and the way to tackle it. In that context, I'd like to suggest, however, that the CDB may want to take on the project of actually documenting the cost of corruption in each of our Caribbean states. So we in Jamaica, we have come to the assessment, mainly with the help of the University of the West Indies and other scholars, that it costs us $100 billion per annum in Jamaican dollars, roughly 5% of the GDP. And all that Mark and Roger have said, just consider in our context how much more that could be done to provide services for our people and to allow us to accomplish our SDGs more effectively, particularly the ones that we're stagnating badly on, which is to eliminate poverty and also to reduce inequality. But taking up Mark's last point, there's a real role for civil society in the experience of national integrity action in relation to the youngsters in school primarily, but also out of school. For the last many years, we have sponsored, set up, in association and partnership with our Ministry of Education, integrity clubs in schools. And it is amazing to see the extent to which the youngsters themselves police their own tuck shop lines. They know the difference between right and wrong, and they themselves are persons who enforce the right and punish the wrong. So it's an important area to begin with. And to the surprise of many, the last survey done of school students in Jamaica between the ages of 10 and 19, so I think it was 2018, found that they were very, very much aware on a national basis of the difference between right and wrong. Where they developed a deficit is how willing they were to take action. And one of the reasons why they were not so willing to take action relates to some points I will make in a few minutes available to me. And that is they don't think anything will be done to correct the deficiency or the wrong, because they look at the society and they see so many wrongs being done by persons in high places and nothing happens. And they replicate that at the level of the school in terms of not taking the kind of action that they ought to. Which leads me to bring to our attention some of the most recent data regarding the extent of the Caribbean people's awareness of the issue of corruption. Very often it is said they don't really know, and obviously they don't know the statistics, and they're not concerned. Well, the 2019 Global Corruption Barometer for Latin America and the Caribbean, sponsored by Transparency International, gives us some interesting data, and I'll share it with you. First of all, the people's views of corruption in government. Is it a big problem or not? In Jamaica, 78% of the people believe corruption is a big problem. In Trinidad and Tobago, 85%. In Guyana, 59%. In the Bahamas, 80%. And in Barbados, 53%. Corruption in government is a big problem. Then, is government doing enough? Let's see the data again. Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, 50-odd% of the people say the government is not doing enough. And in the region as a whole, Latin America and the Caribbean, that's 57%. Finally, and most importantly, and from my point of view, and I think from our point of view, most interesting, can the people make a difference? Results, overall, Latin America and the Caribbean, 77% of those interviewed in the various states, and there were 20 states being interviewed, feel that people can make a difference. In the Bahamas, that was 85%. In Guyana, 82%. Jamaica, 73%. Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados, 70%. And beyond that, in Jamaica, 61% of the people say they are willing to get involved in the combat of corruption. So, the next big question, why the gap between this level of awareness of the problem and the extent of citizen engagement in tackling the problem? And I suggest that there are 4 interrelated reasons. One, too many of our people now are preoccupied with just survival. They don't have no time for anything else, trying to put bread on the table to make 2 ends meet. Secondly, fear, victimization of all sorts, very prevalent in our society. Thirdly, and very importantly, cynicism, skepticism. Nothing going to happen. Even if I exert myself, things not going to change. And of course, last but not least, a simple lack of information as to where they can go do to engage to get some action as a result. And it is in that context, against the background of the gap between the level of awareness of the citizenry as a whole and the inadequate levels of citizen participation, that I want to come to the main solutions as I see it, some mentioned by Roger and Mark. First of all, good legislation, absolutely essential. It's good that many of our states in the region have access to information laws. I don't think they're being used enough. Jamaica is regarded as one of the few states in the hemisphere where the awareness and use of the ATI legislation is at an admirable level. Secondly, and very recently and very much on the front page in Jamaica today, is whistleblower legislation. And I'm glad Roger made much of that. The Protected Disclosures Act in Jamaica was passed in 2011. It's 10 years old, but it's Jamaica's best kept secret. So just a few days ago, National Integrity Action appeared before the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, making representation, number one, to make the Public Disclosure Act and the protection for whistleblowers to be a national campaign. And secondly, to strengthen the law in terms of protection and incentive. We looked at the fact and made submissions to Parliament that in the United States, in Ghana, in South Korea, in Canada, incentives are provided, financial incentives based on the extent of recovery as a result of the disclosure. So that legislation, to be known, is very, very important. Related to that, of course, is effective law enforcement. It's one thing to have the law. It's another thing to ensure that it's enforced and seen to the people to be enforced. And to that extent, NIA has partnered over the years with the appropriate funding in helping to train the investigators, the prosecutors, and to sensitize the judges on the critical importance of enforcing the law in respect of various types of corruption, particularly against those in high places who continue to enjoy impunity across our region. Thirdly, tools for citizen participation. And we have found that recently there's an upsurge in the use of the hotlines for the Auditor General's office to make reports. For Crime Stop 311, the number of anonymous reports coming in now of wrongdoing and potential criminal activity have improved by 70% in 2022 over 2021. But from our perspective, most important, we feel it is critical to have a sustained marketing communication program. What would that do? It would tie the general disapproval of corruption, which the citizens feel, and that think that not enough is being done, with their daily trials and tribulations, the bad roads, the inadequate school feeding program, so that they themselves, when they see that link, will not only engage in the specific demonstration about a bad road, but link it to the need to get involved in strengthening the accountability and transparency requirements, particularly to ensure that contracts are not awarded on the basis of nepotism, on the basis of partisanship, which is a major issue in Jamaica, particularly in the infrastructure area. Secondly, the sustained communication program, and this perhaps is the most important element, has to demonstrate by concrete examples, by familiar examples, where citizens' participation can make a difference and bring positive results. It's great cynicism. What me can do? My little me. So you need to be constantly showing them, using the most recent examples, that your engagement makes a difference. In Jamaica, there are many examples, but these are ignored largely if they're not brought to the attention of the people by National Integrity Action, other civil society groups like JAMP, in columns in the newspapers, in presentations on television. Most recently, give you a concrete example. The government decided that the 60th anniversary of Jamaica's independence being celebrated in this year, there would be no festival song competition. Entries were not up to standard according to the government. The entire citizenry said absolutely not. Our 60th anniversary must have a festival song appropriately qualified and tested and disseminated. The government had to backtrack. And we use that example and so many others, which are more in the realm of institutions and governance, to demonstrate your activity does matter. But very, very importantly and lastly, this cannot be a 9-day wonder. The education, awareness building, communication marketing program cannot be like an election campaign. It's 3 weeks and it's gone. We have found in NIA that it has had to be sustained, supported by advocacy in order to get results. That's how we got campaign finance legislation in Jamaica after 9-10 years of campaigning. That's how we're going to ensure that the whistleblower legislation is stronger. And that's how we're going to ensure that the youngsters at the level of the schools begin to see the importance of not just being aware of what is wrong and what is right.
I think we've lost Professor Munroe. So perhaps this is a good time to kind of segue into Jeanette. Trevor, we lost you for a bit. Okay, I think he's... Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Munroe. I guess we can return to Professor Munroe when we have the round of questions. But thank you very much for giving us some of the insight in terms of some of the impediments to public accountability. And I think that's a useful shift into your work, Jeanette, in terms of how do you strengthen existing institutions and enhance public accountability in Jamaica and overcoming some of these challenges as mentioned by Trevor. So over to you, Jeanette.
Thank you very much, Josh. Good morning again to all my panelists and to all the attendees. It's really very good to be back here with you this December at this conference. I learned tremendous much the last one, and it's good to be contributing again today. Now, when I think about the Sustainable Development Goals, and any one that I would want to impact, if I had to choose one, and naturally we want to be working on more than one, it would have to be SDG 16. I think this is the one that underlies all the prospects for outcomes for all the others. If we don't pay attention to 16, we are going to compromise and we are going to have an obstruction for any goals that we have to have zero hunger, quality education, sustainable cities, and good health. I think this really does underpin everything in terms of having stronger institutions, as it says, giving voice to citizens and encouraging participation. And that's exactly what JAMP was birthed 3 years ago to do. Very interestingly, Josh, when I looked at the breakout of 16 last night, I saw on a United Nations page that this involved digital governance, good governance, participatory democracy, civil society, and developing effective, it said, accountable and transparent institutions at all levels. We want to ensure, it says, responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. Now, if we had that, I think we would pretty much be putting all the other 16 in place. So when I looked at those, I was particularly heartened because that's precisely all the ones that JAMP has been working towards. I want to just underscore what Dr. Koranteng said. He said, though, that when we're dealing with corruption, it is, I wrote it down, it says, this is a behavior that is deeply rooted in our culture, and it is powerful. And when we were forming JAMP and we were lining up ourselves to how we wanted to impact corruption, we asked ourselves the question, isn't this a matter of human nature that we're dealing with? Is it going to be enough? Is it going to be enough to build strong institutions, create a good policy framework and a good legal framework? And the answer for us was no. It is increasingly important that we include the citizen. With all of those things in place, I don't think we're going to get very far. And then I think Canon Kendall touched on it when he said education is key. So what is JAMP doing? In addition to the work that the National Integrity Action mentioned, we are constructing digital tools. And we say digital because that's the age that we're living in. We want Jamaicans here to have two things. We want to bridge the gap in information. It's going to be impossible to fight corruption if citizens don't have access to the information that they need. And the second thing that we're doing is that we want to bridge the gap in accessibility. Accessibility, yes, to information, but accessibility to the power brokers, accessibility to our elected representatives, and also, very importantly, the accessibility of Jamaicans living in the diaspora, who we believe can also have a very important part to play. So last year, I shared that there were 3 digital tools that we had that were dealing with exactly what the forum has asked us to look at: the methods for prevention, detection, investigation, and sanctioning of corruption. Now, let me just give you a very practical example. Jamaicans woke up one morning and on the front page of the news, we saw that the Jamaica Urban Transit Corporation, that's our public transport system, had $429 million spent on fuel, spare parts, tires, and dealer services, but 98% of those contracts were awarded without public tender. Later in that report, it said that 16.6 billion was spent on 33 contracts with no public knowledge or tender. We got up another morning and we looked at the Ministry of Education. We discovered that $1.3 billion was awarded via contracts for school repairs, all awarded without public tender and without public knowledge. I think most of us in this room already is aware of the dangers of direct contracting. But the question we ask ourselves is, when the citizen of Jamaica or any citizen in Caribbean, because I know these headlines are not unique to us, when we wake up and we see this, how can we empower citizens, notwithstanding the legal framework that we have to have and the policy framework? I pause to say Jamaica has 9 anti-corruption legislation, 9 of them. And yet those are the headlines we're still getting. So I put it to us that that is still not enough. What does the citizen do when an Auditor General's report, for example, comes out saying all of this? And JAMP's approach to the anti-corruption is to say, okay, I don't think it's unique in Jamaica either. What happens after the parliament sits and discusses this? What happens after the interviews on the radio with the responsive accountable officers happen? What happens when it disappears from the headlines? What can citizens do to what we call here in Jamaica, combat the 9-day wonder? The idea that we all talk about it for 9 days and then it is forgotten. The idea that our leaders just have to sit uncomfortably for a few minutes and then we'll pass on to the next issue. Well, we decided that the thing citizens needed to do was to have a database that they could easily access this information, and not only access the information to get the details of what went wrong, but to also be aware of what did our supreme audit institution, what did the Auditor General say needed to be done to correct it. That's 2 very important pieces of information. The next thing that we wanted to do was not just leave them with the information, because I have found that if you tell me all the things that's going wrong, but you don't empower the citizen to do something about it, it actually brings around this malaise and this idea that we call in Jamaica a soddy thing set, it not change. So in addition to the information, we have to provide citizens with access to the accountable officers. So JAMP has created a database of all these breaches over the last 5 years that we think we need to pay attention to. In addition to providing that information, we provide them the 4 accountable officers and all their contact information that citizens can feel that, yes, I know who they are. I have a picture. I know their names. And I am empowered to reach out to say, congratulations on fixing this, minister. Or, minister, you're not far enough in this matter. Where do we go? The power of social media is also utilized. The buttons are there. You're not happy with how it is. You spit it out in the social media domain. And as Trevor said, we have seen that tool work very powerfully in Jamaica. I complain sometimes about how irresponsible our leaders can be. But one of the ingredients I say for change in Jamaica is the fact that our leaders are quite responsive, as Trevor said, when we lean in. And social media has become one of those tools for accessibility. So that's one tool that we have created. The Member of Parliament's tracker is one way, again, of getting citizens used to the idea that not just us that need to be compliant with the laws, but our parliamentarians do. Parliament is the seat of accountability. The budget and what we're going to do with it starts there. The reports on what government is doing with our money goes back there. And they have a very important responsibility to oversee what government is doing. So we as citizens want to oversee what the overseers are doing. So we have created a portal that also tracks what our members of parliament are doing. So for example, we had a parliamentarian who's a member of cabinet who was removed from the cabinet by virtue of a serious breach in our energy policy. That parliamentarian has only attended parliament for 37% of the time since he was removed from the cabinet. Should the citizen be aware of that? Yes. So attendance records are made public. We draw on government data. We provide that to the public. And we also track things like how do they spend the money at the constituency level for accountability. Last but by no means least, we have a legislative tracker because JAMP views the citizens' reticence to engage is also about not understanding how the parliament works, not understanding how government works. So going back to the issue of education, our legislative tracker unpacks the process of bills going through parliament, joint select committees meeting, what are the citizens saying? Tomorrow, we are releasing a tool that I think is going to be a game changer, or at least I hope it is. It's the idea of putting on a cell phone the budget of Jamaica. We call it in our office the family budget. And the question around corruption in providing this for the first time is, can the citizen open the newspaper today and see that the government is going to spend $120 million on a bridge? Should they be able to pick up either a document or their phone and be able to verify, was that approved by our parliament? You see, I think our anti-corruption efforts need to begin a little earlier than when we actually discover a report from the Auditor General. We want to get citizens accustomed to the idea that they are the final check and balance and that they are really the stakeholders and owners of the country. But my challenge with that, folks, is that in all that we have been saying about citizens' participation, we have to give them the tools. We have to give them the information. We have to empower them. So we believe that having the granularity of a budget that will tell you how many cows and pigs the government will be buying this year will be a game changer. And finally, we thought it would be very important to provide citizens with information on how public funds flow from government to the private sector. Most of us here know that that nexus between the private and public is where we run into trouble. And Jamaica's had an amazing 14-year-old database of procurement information lying down somewhere. So we have created a database with a 14-year history. Going forward, we will be working with the state's anti-corruption agencies to continue to populate that database. Not just that the citizen, the media, and anti-corruption agencies can track the patterns and trends, but very importantly, the private sector. I shared 2 examples of tenders where nobody knows anything about it. Imagine the private sector being able to say, hold on a minute, I didn't know about that. And it opens up a narrative and a conversation that cannot happen now. So in essence, that is JAMP's effort, creating digital tools citizens can use to bridge information, as well as giving them access to the important elected representatives and allowing our diaspora to participate. Is not just an anti-corruption effort, Josh, but what the way JAMP tends to put it is, we are more for something than against something. We are more for accountability than we are about being anti-corruption. So these are tools to improve accountability, which we believe will cascade over into the country's anti-corruption efforts. So that's our stab at identifying, preventing, and detecting corruption. And I hope that has inspired a few people who might be listening.
And thank you very much, Jeanette, for that. A lot of your work, again, being public accountability related. And there are several questions in the chat that I would like to refer you to.
Sure.
I saw that Canon Kendall, thank you for responding to one of those questions. We were very short on time. You know, it's very difficult managing a 4-person panel. But I would encourage some of you to just respond to those questions in the chat as we go through the final round of perhaps what are your takeaways for this session? So what are the top 1, 2, 3 points to take away from this session? Of course, we're looking at prevention, We're looking at sanctions, detection, but more specifically solutions. So what are some of these solutions? Is all lost? So we'll start with you, Janet, and then come back around to Dr. Koranteng at the end.
Not at all. I mean, one of the things I say at the start of any workshop we do is that it is my belief, and really building on work that Professor Munroe has done, that all the ingredients are in place for Jamaica for change to happen. We have the legislation, we have an amazing amount of press freedom, we have the oversight of Parliament, we have an active civil society group, and as I said, we have a responsive government that when the people lean in, Josh, it shouldn't always require that much leaning in. But I think enough is in place. The only thing that is missing from our assessment are citizens that are confident enough in their knowledge to be able to be confident enough to engage. And we're trying to close that gap. I would say we have done an amazing job in the last 60 years, but this generation to take all those ingredients, engage, press in, advocate, it is definitely possible. And that's the only reason why we're doing what we do.
And thank you very much, Jeanette. It's about leaning in and encouraging citizens to lean in. Trevor, over to you. Your takeaway. Sorry, you need to unmute.
Yeah, encouraging citizens to get involved is a 1 day, 2 day, 1 week, every month,
absolutely,
throughout the year occupation. And encouraging them to get involved means demonstrating to them that their involvement is not a waste of time. So we need to be consciously, civil society has that primary responsibility. The media, which is regarded in our region as the least corrupt of the various institutions as well, we need to fulfill that responsibility more. But to do that, Josh, and this is the point I wanted to have concluded on and emphasize, we need fuel in the tank. You can have the best civil society vehicle. If it does not have gas to run, it's going to be standing still and looking very wonderful. And that's a major issue that the international development partners have been very helpful. We would like institutions like the CDB to look at the possibility of strengthening civil society in relation to fulfilling the obligations to get our citizens involved in building good governance.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Again, strengthening civil society, which is a part of the voice and accountability, good governance indicator. Canon, Kendall, over to you. What are some of the key takeaways from your presentation in 1 minute?
What I would like to reiterate is that there needs to be more investment in prevention, particularly in education, both public and formal education. And we need to stop judging these agencies simply by the amount of convictions and the asset recovery successes that they have. I think we need to look at education, and it's from cradle to grave. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we see that other team coming out in terms of public education and supporting financing or investing in public education. Thank you very much, Canon, Kendall. And Dr. Koranteng, in 1 minute, what are your key takeaways for this session?
Yeah, my key takeaway will be, if I look around the world, how corruption has been managed, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we have to look forward on this. There are two ways of dealing with corruption. First, you can go for the organic ground swelling way. But if we're also happy, if we're fortunate to have a leader, a prime minister or a president who is anti-corruption crusader, that works because it makes life very easy, because then he cracked the whip at the top. That we don't have. It happened once in a long generation, like happened in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, or Malaysia, or whatever. In our generation, we don't have such leaders. So the only option we have is the organic one, the ground swelling one. And that is what Prof. Munroe and Jeanette have been talking about, where you are leading the citizen to demand an exact accountability from our leaders in terms of fighting corruption. Now, how do you do it? Because you can have all the civil society in place, you can have all the legislation in place, you can have even sensitize the citizen, but the key component is leadership. Who is leading the citizens to exact accountability? And that's where it is very important that, because everybody will be sitting at home, they know everything is wrong with the system, but they are sitting at home. So who leads them? And that's why the leaders of civil society group is important, and I support that, particularly the work the two of them are doing. And therefore, leadership is key. International organizations need to support local civil society groupings like the two of them are doing. And that will lead the society to exact and demand accountability from the citizen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koranteng. And I would like to thank everyone on the panel, Dr. Koranteng, Canon Kendall, Professor Munroe, Ms. Calder, for your participation on the panel, but also for your key takeaways. The big one being lean in as citizens, get involved, but also the major thing that is, the big elephant in the room, which is funding for civil society organizations, investing in public accountability, specifically in education. So perhaps that's a role for the Caribbean Development Bank, and we can put a plug here for them to explore those options. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time, but of course, we will try to respond to your questions that were posed. And thank you very much, all members of the panel, and to the audience, thank you again.
Thank you very much for having us, Josh, and members of the panel. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Welcome.